Hello. In this series of lectures, we will cover communicating in the job search process. This series of lectures will include 3 areas: resumes, cover letters, and your online portfolio. Part 1 starts with resumes. So resumes are a unique opportunity to present ourselves in a specific job selection process. That is to say that resumes are what we send to employers to let them know who we are and how we are qualified for a particular job position. They come in many flavors. There is no one right resume. Almost every single industry has different ways of representing the resume. As you see here on the first screen, the CV is a resume for academic individuals. The resume on the bottom left is a design-based resume. Some resumes will have pictures. Some will have graphics. There is no one right resume, but what you need to know is what your industry calls for in a resume and what someone who wants to hire you requires in that resume. So, as in most communicative situations, we have to ask ourselves about the rhetorical situation. In this instance, the resume has but one purpose, and that is to get you to the next step, which in most cases is a job interview. You also have to consider your audience. Your audience is often your future boss and potentially the HR department who hires for your boss, and also some of the other people who you may or may not work with. The tone for a resume is formal, and you use the most formal language, the most formal ways of addressing people, etc. The context is very specific. You'll be addressing typically a specific job ad, or maybe you visited a job fair. In any case, those are your contacts and you'll be working with them. Lastly, there is a culture associated with this process and an opportunity to match the job. Every job has a culture, and thus the hiring process comes with a culture as well, and you need to be able to fit into that culture. Resumes, being very traditional, have a series of ways of being organized. You will typically see either a chronological, functional, or some kind of a combination of resumes. A chronological resume is very simple. It is organized based on the most recent information. These resumes are typically for individuals who either have little work experience or have been in the same position for quite some time. For example, I have a friend who's been working at Kraft as a chemical engineer for the last 15 years. A chronological resume will suit her fine. She hasn't jumped around into industries or anything like that. Or a functional resume, that might suit someone who's been in the same industry but maybe has had multiple jobs. For example, let's say that you work in the food industry and you've been working as one of the managers for a chain or different chains of restaurants. You might use a functional resume in order to showcase the series of related skills and experiences across that genre. Or if you've had other kinds of experiences, whether you have had some time out of work, perhaps you went back to school, or if you have jumped from industry to industry like myself, you might need a combination resume. And then that would help to explain your story, to build on, where you were at school, what you learned there versus where you were at work. And if you were at different industries at that time, a combination resume helps to articulate that process. Regardless of which type of way you organize your resume, they all have to be targeted, customized for the specific job that you're applying for. Regardless of which resume you need to build, it will take some time. So you really need to allocate some time to look over what you've been doing and what you want to accomplish in order to make sure that the resume really sells who you are. This takes time. One of the most interesting things about a resume is that it continues to grow with you. So as you add experiences, you get to change your resume to reflect those experiences, which means that most people go back to their resume maybe every few years to be sure to update it and add anything that is new. There are obviously exceptions to this rule. Some industries have much longer resumes than 1 or 2 pages. Obviously, you can't make any spelling mistakes, or you shouldn't, or grammar mistakes, because that is very telling about how carefully you crafted these documents. I've heard tell of some recruiters who toss your resume in the circular file, also known as the garbage, immediately if they find one misspelling. Your resume needs to be clear and easy to understand, and we'll go through some of these ideas in just a few minutes. One big thing you need to do is you should look for examples in your field. If you are going to be an audio engineer, a chemical engineer, a technical communicator, or someone who's in the food industry, you need to find examples of what your resumes look like, because they do change. You'll note that when you write your resume, the language that you use will be a bit more formal. You will not use I and my in the resume. Instead, you'll use action verbs, and you'll see an example of that in just a moment. When you print your resume, and the instances where you need to do so, you will print on plain white paper. Colored paper for resumes is not at all a good idea. There are some textures that you can purchase in paper for cotton paper that might set your resume apart from other resumes when you're in a situation where you're going to be handing your resume to someone. Typically, in the kinds of jobs that we'll be talking about in this class, you will not include a picture. No fancy fonts or other adornments will decorate your resume. Instead, the resume will be very traditional. It'll have a series of background facts. You'll arrange those facts into clear groups. You'll construct headings for those groups. Your resume will have current contact information, and it will also include something called a summary of your accomplishments. So the resume that you make now as potentially a younger student, and the resume that you make as you grow older, whether or not you've had 1 year of experience or 30 years of experience, the process essentially is the same. You need to identify the type of work that you do or that you want to do. You need to write down those skills and that criteria, so that the people who are planning to interview you or hire you later can understand what it is you bring to that job. The situation calls for you communicating clearly with the person on the other end of the line. So you need to tell them why you are the person for the job. And you want to include everything about yourself that is relevant to that hire. If it's not relevant, you're going to leave it off. This is going to be a difficult process, especially as you progress down in your career. Can you imagine 30 years of experiences with just a 2-page resume? It becomes very difficult. In our case, we need to think back over the things that are no longer helpful. For example, there is no reason in most cases you should list your high school. No one really cares what high school you went to any longer once you have graduated college, right? So you shouldn't list that. In actuality, after you have graduated college and you're out of college a few years down the road, no one will care about your GPA either. There'll be things that you'll leave off as you go along. Last but not least, a lot of resumes used to include something called an objective. But if you think rhetorically about that construct, you can recognize just how flawed it is. What is the objective of every single resume? That is to get a job. And essentially, that's what the objective said. I want a job in this field. Well, that's duh. You've already applied to that field. We already know you want a job in that field. A better use of that space is something called a summary, where you can provide a brief overview of who you are and your experiences and shape that into one statement. As you see in this example here, something like a recent graduate with a particular degree in a specific topic. Then you can highlight something that you find valuable. You're highly organized or whatever. We'll see some more examples of the summary in lieu of the objective statement a bit later. For your first resume, if you haven't done one, you need to go through and take an inventory of your skills, your positive personal characteristics, your technical and computer skills. You get a chance here to even write down any relevant coursework. So if you've been working toward an accountant's degree for the last couple of years, and you've taken a series of courses that might explicate that process, you can write down that class and talk about that coursework. Obviously in a separate section than jobs, but on the resume. You can write down any educational accomplishments, and if you have an excellent GPA, you can include that. You can talk about any skills and experiences gained during internships or summer jobs or volunteer jobs. You can also talk about any time that you've had recognition or award or competitions, etc. And obviously you include your work history, but what people often don't think about is including unpaid work history, especially if it relates to your target position. So here's an example of a resume, and I'm just showing you this one in order to show you how they are organized, the big blocks of text and how your eye can easily see those blocks and where they are on the page. For example, you typically put your contact information at the top in box 1. And then in this case, there's an objective here, which this one might be warranted. In most cases, it's not. And then a list of qualifications, pilot credentials, etc. But you can clearly see where the boxes are. Anyone looking at this resume can find what they're looking for immediately. Here's an example of a resume that might be more typical of what you might create. You can see at the top the contact information, and then there's that summary statement. Since this is a graduate who's recently out of school, education is next. That's prioritized. You're going to prioritize the information on your resume from the top to the bottom, the most important stuff first, the least important stuff last. And in this case, he's got some relevant skills and knowledge that he wants to associate with that education. So it's directly underneath there, right? Things he's acquired through education, and you can read more clearly about what that is when you read about it. Relevant experience follows. Notice he says relevant. So if you happen to do something that's not exactly relevant to your job, you may not leave it on there. For example, for a very long time, I was in metallurgical engineering. At the very same time, I was working as a copy person who actually made copies at the copy shop on the side, right? That wasn't relevant. The next time I applied to an engineering job, I totally left that job off. And here's the rest of Kevin's resume. You can see he goes on with relevant experiences. That's broken into specific chunks. And that part is done chronologically with the most recent jobs at the top. And then toward the bottom, you can see the extracurricular activities and the services that he mentions here. And in that case, he explicates what's going on, explains how they're related, etc., and then ends with a computer and related skills comment. So as you saw from that example, it shows you how the resumes are organized, and obviously you're going to organize it according to your own specific experiences. But one of the things we need to talk about prior to the ending of this particular video are the keywords, because now many of the resumes are being organized or sorted by computer. So it helps us to know that not only were humans already checking for keywords, but programs are being built to look for specific keywords when the job application comes in. And so it helps the reviewer and it helps the computer to figure out what's on the resume. But what you need to do then is find examples from your field and then use those keywords. For example, here's this list on the right-hand side. This sort of tells you what to look for. People will call certain skills differently, software and technology competencies differently, etc. So you should check and see, do they say degrees or do they say certifications? What are the product names that they use in some of their resumes? What are some of the technical terms and industry jargon? So you need to look for those things and make sure you use them appropriately in order to be tagged when your resume comes across someone's desk. Here's an example. The keywords are shown in yellow. And then you'll see in a second what action verbs are in association with the resume. So for example, in the US, we say a bachelor's degree. Sometimes we'll say a BS or a BA. So putting down the exact words that your industry is more familiar with will help you out, because maybe they're not going to have the abbreviated one. Up here at the top, you see technical documentation or instructional materials. So you need to have a good understanding of how your industry communicates information. Once you know that, then you can use the keywords that are common in that field so that your resume is flagged. Here are some of those action words. So as you write down those bullet points that talks about what you did in your job, you use a verb. So you might say something like, I wrote technical documentation, or I graduated with a degree, etc., etc. So you want to make sure that you are using the appropriate sets of keywords that describe your experiences. So we spoke a little bit earlier about the summary statement or the objective statement. I just wanted to go into just a little bit more detail about the summary statement. So a summary essentially becomes a statement that's the first thing that the reviewer would see. And it should give a good description of who you are and where you've been or what you've been up to. And it should communicate that clearly. And you can also obviously use those keywords we just spoke about to get your reviewer's attention. So take a look at the one down here when you can see it's not exactly even a paragraph, and they've called it a profile. On the right, you can see 10 plus years success of high profile technology companies, including Dell and Apple, and then 4 results. The one above that is more of a paragraph style, and it talks about their accomplishments. So spend some time thinking about what your summary might say and how it might draw the attention of your reader. Okay, on to references. So references are those people who will say good things about you. And at some point in time, you might be asked to provide them. So one of the few tips about references are, do eliminate that line that says provided upon request. Everybody sort of knows you're going to provide them when they request them. Second, check with your references prior to listing them. So don't just give someone's information without having already consulted them. And that gives you a chance when you contact them about giving references to get the most up-to-date information for you to distribute. And then when you do references, a lot of times nowadays they're not always attached to your resume. But if they are, put your best foot forward first, right? So put the folks you want them to contact first, second, third, and fourth, in whatever order you want, because it should favor your story. So if you have, for example, people who can tell you about a personal reference or people who can tell you about a professional reference, you may want to put the professional references first, the personal references last. Or if you're like in my case, you've jumped between a few jobs, maybe you organize it by 2 previous jobs or 1 last job or whatever. But give it some thought because your references and who they contact should positively reflect on you. So for a quick recap of the whole resume process, think about the rhetorical situation. The resume is not about you, but it's about the audience. So you need to be able to communicate clearly with that audience, which may mean creating a summary statement about your qualifications for the job. It does mean finding industry-specific keywords and using active language in your resumes. You need to organize your resume well with effective headings where you put the most important stuff first. It should tell a story about you. It is clearly a recap of your experiences, and it is shaped for the reader. They should come away knowing who you are and what kind of employee you will be. And keep in mind that ethics are essential. Make sure that your information is not only clear, but it is also accurate. On the right-hand side, you can see there are a few links that you can use to find out more about creating resumes. Some of these links may or may not be clickable. I apologize, but you can certainly write them down. There will be additionally some handouts that you'll be able to download as well in the classroom. Thanks for listening.